Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave and the third video, the final part of Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. In this part we'll look at chapters 11 through 21. Chapter 11, Strait of Magellan, Climate of the Southern Coast. In late May of 1834 there is a second attempt to reach the Pacific Ocean, but this one failed too. So on the 1st of June, which remember we're in the southern hemisphere, which is the beginning of winter, they reach Port Famine, the same harbor where it all began to fall apart on the first journey. Along the way they pick up two sailors, who had abandoned their ship in favor of living with the natives, but now they are miserable and happy to rejoin a British ship. Shortly thereafter, Darwin climbs Mount Tarn, which is a bit to the south of Port Famine, but it is, in his words, a miserable mountain, and he has a tough time climbing it. On the 8th of June, Captain Fitzroy once more tries to reach the Pacific, and he finally reaches it, coming out of the Cockburn Channel on the 10th. No doubt to the great joy of Darwin, who had previously written to his sister that, "I am become thoroughly tired of these countries. A live megatherium would hardly support my patience." Darwin makes comments about the climate and notices a lot of differences between South America and Northern Europe, despite being on equal if opposite latitudes. He also notices the enormous glaciers that he can see from a distance, the impact that earthquakes have on them, and how they could transport enormous boulders. He seems to be thinking along the lines of an ice age, a theory that began to pick up steam at exactly that time. Chapter 12, Central Chile. On July 23rd, Darwin and the Beagle, or more precisely the Beagle and Darwin, reach Valparaiso, a harbor in central Chile at about the same latitude as Chile's capital, Santiago, which is farther inland. Speaking of going inland, on the 14th of August he goes on a geologizing trip. One of the things he finds are shells, this time as high up as 1300 feet or 400 meters, along with what he identifies as marine mud. He goes on a couple more days, having hired guasos, Chilean cowboys, as guides. On August 27, he goes back to Santiago, and a few days later he visits a church. Though he doesn't state this explicitly, this is almost certainly a Roman Catholic church, while Darwin was connected with the Anglican Church, a historically English branch of Protestantism. He describes the following admonition he received from one of the people he encounters there. "Why do you not become a Christian? For our religion is certain." I assured them I was a sort of Christian, but they would not hear of it. Appealing to my own words, "Do not your own padres, your very bishops, marry?" The absurdity of a bishop having a wife particularly struck them. They scarcely knew whether to be most amused or horror-struck at such an enormity. For those without a Christian background, padres or priests and bishops of the Catholic Church remain celibate for as long as they hold that office. In contrast, almost all other branches of Christianity where church leaders are allowed to marry. Having read more about Darwin's life, his personal convictions about the truth of the Bible and Christianity would later change, but at this point in his life at least, he still calls himself a sort of Christian. After this, he spends much of September making his way southward by land and comments on the many things he observes, including local geology, archaeology, flora and fauna, despite getting sick at some point. He also notices that there are several volcanoes and hot springs, like Termas de Cauquenes, in this region, something that will become relevant soon. Chapter 13, Chiloé and Chonos Islands. In November, he and the Beagle travel south. The goal is to map out the island and archipelago of Chiloé, which is south from Santiago. They start their mapping of the island on the 24th, and Darwin opts to accompany the land-based team. The weather is dreadful, by the way, and he complains about the rain. Chile had gained its independence from Spain in 1826 after a 15-year war for independence, but the archipelago of Chiloé was still held by Spain and its governor Antonio de Quintanilla, who would rule this last Spanish outpost until 1852, after which it was absorbed by Chile. On November 26, he saw a smoking volcano and noticed that there were 3 volcanoes active at the same time. On the 6th of December, Darwin and the Beagle reached the southernmost point of the main island. Here he sneaks up on a fox and smashes it on the head with his geological hammer. The poor thing did not survive and was later put on display in the Museum of the Zoological Society. The species in question is called Lycalopex fulvipes, commonly known as Darwin's fox. I mean, that's one way to get things named after you. The Beagle continues to explore the archipelago, and on the 28th of December they find some shipwrecked folks who had been stuck there for the past 15 months. Their isolation and deprivation formed an interesting parallel with the Voyagians, who had been civilized and subsequently returned to their native ways. These sailors had turned into miserable vagabonds, but were reabsorbed into society quickly after being rescued. On the last pages of this chapter we slip into 1835. Happy New Year! Chapter 14, Chiloé and Concepcion, Great Earthquake. On January 15, 1835, the Beagle sailed away, and 3 days later the Osorno volcano erupted, along with 2 other ones. Darwin travels farther on land and goes first to Castro, then to Cuaco, and finally takes the ferry to visit a small Indian settlement. He notices that they were very poor and mistreated, almost as though they were slaves. On the 26th he re-embarks at St. Carlos, and they leave Chiloé on the 4th of February. On the 12th, Darwin is traveling north of Chiloé by land again. He reaches a small village and comments on the connection he observes between Christianity and morality. He notices that around Curico, a small settlement, the Indians are all Christians, but farther north they are unconverted and polygamous. This begins to cement a belief in Darwin that Christianity has a civilizing effect on native people groups. Appreciating Christianity not for its doctrinal or spiritual truth, which he would later question, but merely for its instrumental social value. Christianity thus becoming a tool to bring moral, civil and ultimately material well-being. He reaches Valdivia, where on the 20th of February one of the most important events of the entire voyage took place. On that day, Concepcion, a city some 335 miles or 210 kilometers to the north, was hit by an enormous earthquake, followed by a tsunami. It is estimated to have been an 8.5 on the Richter scale. Some 50 people died during the earthquake, and Darwin would later personally survey the damage at Concepcion when the Beagle arrived there on March 4. Darwin recounts several stories from survivors in his book, including that apparently the tsunami had a height of 23 feet or 7 meters, and a few days later he would write to his sister that surveying the aftermath at Concepcion was one of the 3 most impactful sights of his voyage so far, the other 2 being the Brazilian rainforest and the site of a Fuegian savage. But more importantly for Darwin and our understanding of geology, he makes note of a number of geological changes. Isla Santa Maria was raised by 10 feet, which is more than 3 meters. He speculates that the elevation of the land might not be an effect of the earthquake, but its cause. Earlier, when he experienced the diluted effects of the earthquake firsthand, he described that it felt as if the earth itself was moving like a thin crust over a fluid. An image familiar to him, as it is how Lyell described earthquakes in his Principles of Geology. At the same time, several volcanoes erupted, and Darwin begins to speculate that these events are all connected to lava that is underneath the surface and to the gradual elevation of mountain ranges like the Andes. Perhaps, he began to theorize, the fact that there are seashells and marine mud high up in the mountains is the result of a series of earthquakes, each subsequent earthquake pushing the former ocean floor higher and higher until you get something as huge and majestic as the Andes Mountains. Chapter 15. Passage of the Cordillera. Darwin left Concepcion a few days later and arrived at Valparaiso on the 11th of March. From here, he wants to take an excursion to Mendoza through the Andes Mountains. After finding some guides, he sets out with some mules to cross the Portillo Pass. While studying the geology high up in the mountains, he begins to think about how long it must have taken for these massive mountains to form and begins to really ponder deep time. Clearly no longer considering the previously accepted biblical timeline of the Earth being created just a few thousand years earlier. The thought of such a relatively young Earth doesn't even cross his mind anymore. At the same time, he was overcome by a sense of awe, as he notes in his personal diary. When we reached the crest and looked backwards, a glorious view was presented. The atmosphere so resplendently clear, the sky an intense blue, the profound valleys, the wild broken forms, the heaps of ruins piled up during the lapse of ages, the bright colored rocks contrasted with the quiet mountains of snow, together produced a scene I never could have imagined. Neither plant nor bird, excepting a few condors wheeling about the higher pinnacles, distracted the attention from the inanimate mass. I felt glad I was by myself. It was like watching a thunderstorm, or hearing in the full orchestra a chorus of the Messiah. Around the 20th of March they cross into Argentina, or as he calls it, the Republic of Mendoza. One interesting thing I learned from reading this is that apparently, at high elevations, water boils at a lower temperature. In fact, boiling water is so cold, I mean comparatively not hot, that you cannot boil potatoes anymore. They left them in boiling water for hours on end, but they were still raw. Other things he noticed when this high up: the moon and the stars are a lot brighter up there, and there is a much quicker buildup of static electricity, such that Darwin's flannel coat glowed when he rubbed it. But perhaps the weirdest thing he encountered was a frozen horse that is on top of an isolated pillar of ice. Upside down? Darwin speculates that this horse likely fell into some deep snow and landed upside down, died, froze, and then the ice surrounding the horse melted. But still a rather strange vista. On this trip he makes more geological observations and makes special note of various strata made of different rock types: porphyries, sandstone, quartz, granite, limestone, clay slate, gypsum, and how they could have formed, speculating about volcanoes, earthquakes, and other processes. On March 23rd, they reach the other side of the Andes, and Darwin notes that there is quite a difference between the species on either side of the mountain. In a footnote, he elaborates his thoughts some more. This is merely an illustration of the admirable laws first laid down by Mr. Lyell on the geographical distribution of animals as influenced by geological changes. The whole reasoning, of course, is founded on the assumption of the immutability of species. Otherwise, the difference in species in the two regions might be considered as superinduced during a length of time. This is yet another piece of the Galapagos puzzle. A practical barrier, be it a stretch of ocean, as between the different islands of the Galapagos, or a mountain range, often correlate with their difference in species, even if the environments aren't that different. However, returning to both sides of the Andes, Darwin notices that though animals are different, plants and insects are quite similar. On March 26, when crossing a desert, Darwin is attacked by a bug called Penchuca, the kissing bug. Its formal name is Triatoma infestans, and if you get bit by one, as Darwin was, it can cause the Chagas disease. It is well known that later in life, Darwin was rather sickly. Though he lived to the age of 73, he often stayed home and was, for example, not able to attend the first public debate about his own theory of evolution. Some people have suggested that the unidentified illness he suffered from might have been this Chagas disease, which he contracted here. But it is also possible that he suffered from any number of other things. They reach Mendoza, which he calls a stupid town, on the 28th, and almost immediately he heads back, this time via the Uspallata Pass. 2 days later he finds petrified trees, buried at an angle in volcanic sandstone, and he spends a lot of time piecing together how this could have come about. He later wrote to his sister Susan, "To the geologist also, there are such manifest proofs of excessive violence. The strata of the highest pinnacles are tossed about like the crust of a broken pie." On April 10, he reaches Santiago again. After he got home and pored over his notes, he put forth a sweeping set of theories about the formation of the two ranges of the Andes and their relative age to the plains of Patagonia, and published it as part of a series on the geology of the Beagle. This really stimulated his imagination about enormous changes over vast distances and long stretches of time. As one biographer put it, "Nothing after this could amaze him. No hypothesis was too improbable for his fertile imagination. If part of the range were as new as he thought they were, almost anything could have happened in the past." He danced from hypothesis to hypothesis and thoroughly enjoyed himself. He was convinced that the majestic story of nature could be explained by the accumulation of little things. Chapter 16: Northern Chile and Peru. On April 27, Darwin sets out northbound from Santiago by land, a treacherous journey as it will take him through a large desert. He finds the coastal road boring, but more inland he finds some interesting things to comment on. On May 14 he reaches Coquimbo, where he catches up to the Beagle, and dines with Captain Fitzroy again. They feel another, smaller, earthquake, and notice that the locals are apparently familiar with them, for as soon as they feel the first tremors, they run outside. Clearly a sign that earthquakes are common in this area. Darwin continues his journey overland, and the going gets tougher and tougher. On June 4, he arrives at Freirina and stays there for a bit. On June 8, he reaches Vallenar and finally finds a little water. The landscape now really becoming desertous. He once again ponders the origin of mountains and briefly speculates about a connection between the weather and earthquakes. However, when he asks the locals about the potential origin of mountains, because remember he often defers to local knowledge, the answers he gets were quite naive. They think that the mountains were just simply there naturally, and they haven't thought about how they could be formed. This leads him to comment about the need for scientific curiosity. Some, however, like a few in England who are a century behindhand, thought that all such inquiries were useless and impious, and that it was quite sufficient that God had thus made the mountains. Later in June he enters Peru, and stumbles across some Indian ruins, perhaps from the Incas? He is quite surprised to find the remains of these settlements in places that make no strategic sense, far away from water. He once again speculates about some major, if gradual, climate change that forced these people away from formerly habitable regions. On the 12th of July, the Beagle arrives in Peru as well, in Iquique to be precise. This city is now part of Chile, but Chile wouldn't conquer this region until the War of the Pacific, which would occur a few decades later. Darwin continues overland still, first visiting the famous saltpeter mines, and then through what he would describe as the first true desert. On July 19, the the Beagle anchors in Lima, and Darwin catches up to them again. However, the political situation is extremely volatile. According to Darwin, no fewer than 4 different warlords are embroiled in a civil war that also involved Bolivia in the so-called Salaverry-Santa Cruz War that lasted from 1835 to 1836. In Lima, the situation was dangerous, especially for foreigners, as even the British consul had been assaulted by a group of renegade soldiers. Darwin didn't want to spend all his time waiting on board the Beagle until Captain Fitzroy was ready to depart. So, together with some merchants, he explores the surroundings of the city. Here he finds more ruins along the coast, which were destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami in 1746. However, unlike what happened in Concepcion, where the land was elevated, here the land appears to have sunk, even though the island of San Lorenzo, right off the coast of Lima, was raised recently. Chapter 17: Galapagos Archipelago. The Galapagos Archipelago. Yes, we have finally arrived at the one destination you were all waiting for. Because if you knew one thing about Darwin's voyage before you started watching this video, it is that he went to the Galapagos and that he gathered finches, right? But what about these finches, as well as other organisms, would later inspire the theory of evolution? You may already know, or think you know where I'm going with this. Your high school teacher may have told the story like this. Darwin found that every island of the Galapagos had a different species of finches, and that each of these species had a differently shaped beak that was perfectly fit for eating the foods of that particular island. And therefore, boys and girls, we know that evolution is true. Now, I don't want to disparage high school biology teachers. And it is true that the Galapagos finches are an interesting case study of perhaps even macroevolution. And these birds did make a distinct impression on the young Darwin. But this story is a bit of an oversimplification. Not only because a lot of new and interesting insights were already made by Darwin before reaching the Galapagos, but also because despite the several new observations he made here, only later, after returning to England, did the significance of Galapagos grow in his mind. So let's start at the beginning. The geography and geology of the Galapagos Islands, and let the Galapagos Puzzle unfold. And I'll try to be brief, for I could easily fill an hour just talking about these islands. The Galapagos are a collection of 127 islands, though only about a dozen of them can be considered large. They are some 560 miles or 900 kilometers west of the South American mainland. In Darwin's own words, the Galapagos Archipelago might be called a satellite attached to America, but it should rather be called a group of satellites, physically similar, organically distinct, yet intimately related to each other, and all related in a marked though much lesser degree to the great American continent. These islands may have been inhabited, or at least visited, by Incas or Polynesians, but when the first Europeans discovered them on March 10, 1535, they were only inhabited by animals. For the next few centuries, it was only occasionally visited by Europeans, and it took until the early 19th century before it was finally inhabited permanently. The Spanish and the British had both been active on these islands, but since 1832 they were formally claimed by Ecuador. Though the Ecuadorians had not yet been able to send a governor, and the only government official was, somewhat ironically, British, and primarily concerned with making sure international mail was passed on smoothly. The origin of the islands is clearly volcanic, like the more famous Hawaiian Islands. Shifting tectonic plates and periodic submarine volcanic eruptions built up over time and formed these islands, as the lava cooled into rocks. Over the course of several weeks, starting on September 15, 1835, Darwin and the Beagle crew would visit several of the main islands, including Chatham Island, Charles Island, Albemarle Island, and James Island. By the way, these are the names that Darwin uses. Today they have different names. Darwin, after spending a lot of time pondering the geology, goes on to describe all sorts of plants and animals. Most of his time is focused on describing a type of aquatic lizard, calling it disgusting and clumsy, and the giant tortoises. At one point he even wrote one, though likely more out of youthful enthusiasm than scientific curiosity or practical necessity. He learns from the locals that these tortoises drink their fill of water only sporadically and keep the fresh water in their bladder. Darwin himself even sips from a tortoise's bladder, presumably after it had been killed, for science! He spends quite some time listing all the different birds, both water and land birds, identifying their species and genera and correlating them to the species on the American mainland, and doing something similar for the reptiles. He also notices that the insects, the reptiles, and the birds are all somewhat different from their mainland counterparts. Sometimes they are a different species, at other times they are the same species, but still a little bit different. Finally, he notices that there are deep troughs between the different islands, which often corresponds to strong currents and heavy winds. This means that though not impossible, it is difficult for animals to cross from one island to the next. And most of the species of lizards, tortoises or birds were therefore limited to only one of the islands, with few exceptions. Now we have all the pieces of the Galapagos puzzle in front of us, and it starts here. First of all, these volcanic islands are young. Younger than the mainland at least. This means that these plants and animals must have come from somewhere else, almost certainly from South America. How exactly is hard to say, but one can speculate about heavy winds or rafts of floating debris after an earthquake caused a landslide or something. Secondly, many of these Galapagos species are not found in South America, even when similar species are. Yet, these Galapagos species are very well adapted to their current environment. In fact, since each island is different, they are adapted to that particular island. This can be illustrated by this comment from Darwin. The inhabitants, as I have said, state that they can distinguish the tortoises from the different islands, and that they differ not only in size, but in other characters. This inhabitant is likely Nicholas Lawson, a British resident on Charles Island, who was in charge of the Ecuadorian penal colony. So, how often did a pair of land-based tortoises make its way from South America to the Galapagos? I say pair, it could have been a pregnant lady, okay, but how many times did that happen? It is a very unlikely event. So, once? Maybe twice? 3 times? That's pushing it. But if each island has a different species of tortoise, and yes, I'm oversimplifying here too, but bear with me, and each of the species that made it to Galapagos happened to land on a different island, and that species subsequently died out in South America, what are the chances of that? And the same is roughly true for the lizards. And the same is roughly true for the land birds, including the mockingbird and the finch. The chances of this happening so many times is just unbelievable. Because if we assume that God created each species to perfectly fit in its environment, then there were a series of environments identical to each of the Galapagos Islands in South America first. Then each of the species somehow ends up sending a representative to the exact island that corresponds to their original South American environment, and then dies out in South America due to a change in the environment, like those massive mammals Darwin discovered in Argentina. Or only one, or perhaps 2 representatives of South American species find their way to the Galapagos Islands, and once they find themselves there, begin to adapt, somehow, via an as of yet unknown process, to its new environment. And over the centuries, some representatives find themselves on the neighboring islands, via a difficult but somewhat less improbable route and subsequently begin to adapt there. Darwin ponders this ability to adapt in the following way. Reviewing the facts here given, one is astonished at the amount of creative force, if such an expression may be used, displayed on these small, barren and rocky islands. What this creative force was, or how it worked, and how it is related to other puzzle pieces, like relative isolation, the overproduction of offspring, and the extinction of species, is something Darwin wouldn't work out for quite some time, but the wheels started turning in his head. Now, circling back to the famous finches. As you can see, they are just one of several types of animals that inspired the theory of evolution. In fact, they are somewhat underrepresented in his book about the voyage and in his initial observations. At first, he thought that each island had a unique species of mockingbird, but that the finches were all the same. He therefore didn't even bother labeling them carefully and lost track of exactly which finch came from which island. In the end, he had to cross-reference his finch collection with that of Captain Fitzroy, who was also an enthusiastic collector when time and occasion permitted. I'm not entirely sure why the finches, of all species, became such a symbol for evolution and the Galapagos Islands. Perhaps it's the easily demonstrable shape and size of their beaks? To illustrate how his mind started working when thinking through his notes on birds, here is a photo from his ornithological notebook of the Galapagos. Right here, near the top, he wrote, "If there is the slightest foundation for these remarks, the zoology of archipelagos will be well worth examining, for such facts would undermine the stability of species." Finally, I want to give a shout out to this happy lady. This is Harriet, a giant tortoise who passed away on June 23rd, 2006, in an Australian zoo. The reason I mention Harriet is because at one point Darwin says that he took 3 young tortoises from 3 different islands. One of them was Harriet, who ended up in this Australian zoo, where she was well taken care of until she died at the ripe old age of roughly 175. It is interesting, for me at least, to realize that my life has overlapped for some 20 years with a tortoise who was picked up by Darwin himself. Chapter 18. Tahiti and New Zealand. The Beagle leaves the Galapagos archipelago for Tahiti on October 20 and arrives there on the 15th of November. These islands have been inhabited by Polynesians for centuries before Europeans arrived in the late 16th century. Today it is part of French Polynesia and are thus administered from Paris. These islands play to the imagination and feature prominently in the famous voyages of Captain Cook and the story of the mutiny on the Bounty. The Tahitians, rather than resisting or passively tolerating Europeans, attempted, with some success, to avoid conflict with Europeans by enthusiastically welcoming them. Tahiti thus became known in Europe as a paradise with the most friendly people you can ever imagine. By the time Darwin arrived, this general principle still applied, though of course there were also some tensions. Tahitians, like Europeans, are human after all, and Captain Fitzroy would play a role in resolving a diplomatic dispute. Darwin himself goes on an inland excursion, because of course he does, and comments on the fact that many Tahitians have since converted to Christianity under the guidance of missionaries. He is positive about this change, even if some of their original habits have persisted, like the fact that they have a lot of tattoos. He even comments that the men were very handsome, but he was less impressed by the women. A rather pedantic and paternalistic comment, but his comments on the appearance of Queen Pomare IV, who was welcomed on the Beagle, is almost insulting, though he admires the piety displayed by the Tahitians. He also philosophizes about whether these missionaries and conversion to Christianity are a net positive for the natives. He references the critical opinions of others, like the Russian explorer Otto von Kutzube, but personally concludes that, on the whole, it appears to me that the morality and religion of the inhabitants are highly creditable. Thinking of a hypothetical sailor being shipwrecked on an island, he believes that they would much rather be found by Christianized natives than by unconverted ones. Though he may be correct in this assessment, it is once more not the truth of the Christian faith that Darwin is interested in or values, but merely the practical result of a people's mass conversion to Christianity, in contrast to their prior practices and beliefs. They leave Tahiti on November 26. On December 19, they first spot New Zealand, and from his remarks, Darwin is becoming homesick. Though if you read his letters, you see he started to become homesick all the way back in March of last year. 2 days later, they enter the Bay of Islands and Darwin makes an excursion to Paia. When talking with and learning about the natives, Darwin is somewhat disturbed and somewhat amused at the same time. He describes the Maori as rather warlike, recounting a story of a tribal leader who decided to go to war for the sole purpose of preventing his gunpowder from expiring without having been used. He is also quite surprised by the fact that, at least in his experience, the locals do not wash their clothes. At all. A few days later, he goes to a missionary-run English farm, which looks almost identical to an English farm in England. This prompts him to be very optimistic about New Zealand's future, and he credits most of the progress made with regards to the civilizing of the country to the missionaries. In fact, he and Fitzroy would co-sign a letter commending the missionaries in Tahiti and New Zealand and speaking in favor of using state funds to continue supporting their efforts. Richard Matthews, remember him from the previous video? The missionary who tried and failed to live with the Voyagians. His brother is also a missionary, living in Waimate, and Richard opts to stay with him. On the 24th, he sees several species of a bird genus he called Dianoris, a huge flightless bird indigenous to New Zealand that has taken up many of the ecological niches in New Zealand that most everywhere else were filled up by mammals. Similar as to how reptiles have taken that spot on the Galapagos Islands, and one could argue marsupials in Australia. Though he also notices that newly introduced animals sometimes easily outcompete the old ones once they're introduced. They leave New Zealand on December 30th. Chapter 19, Australia. The Beagle arrives on January 12, 1836, at Port Jackson, Australia. Darwin ponders how the British managed their colonies versus how the Spanish managed theirs. By his estimation, the British are far better, and he even congratulates himself and is very proud to be an Englishman. A bit chauvinistic, and British colonialism was by modern standards atrocious, but I do think he has a point that the Spanish somehow managed to be substantially worse. And I'm not only saying that because the Netherlands also used to be a de facto Spanish colony. One of the things that Darwin sees happening in Australia is that the convicts who were sent there were used by the local government to develop infrastructure. As for the Aboriginals, which he has seen described in what passed for anthropological reports back then, as utterly degraded beings. But in Darwin's eyes, they appeared far from being such utterly degraded beings as they have usually been represented. On the whole, they appear to me to stand some few degrees higher in the scale of civilization than the Voyagians. Now, I don't want to be too critical of Darwin, as for his time he was certainly relatively enlightened in his views on race, but this kind of ranking of different people groups is of course extremely problematic, and shows a deeply ingrained English supremacist view of the world. At the same time, he is clear-eyed enough to see the enormous downside to Europeans waltzing around the planet like they own it. Wherever the European has trod, death seems to pursue the Aboriginal. we may look at the wide extent of the Americas, Polynesia, the Cape of Good Hope, and Australia, and we find the same result. The varieties of man seem to act on each other in the same way as different species of animals, the stronger always extirpating the weaker. Comparing different ethnicities to different species of animals is again problematic, but he does have a point about the devastating effect of Europeans on native populations, regardless of whether those effects were intended or not. Of course, Darwin goes on a few geological excursions, including to Bathurst and the surrounding area. On January 30, the Beagle leaves the Australian mainland and arrives at Hobart Town on February 5th for a quick 2-day visit to Tasmania. After that, they go to King George's Sound in the southwest of Australia, where they arrive on March 6. Darwin really hopes to see a kangaroo, but he has no luck. He poetically waves Australia goodbye with these melancholic lines. "Farewell, Australia, you are a rising infant and doubtless some day will reign a great princess in the south. But you are too great and ambitious for affection, yet not great enough for respect. I leave your shores without sorrow or regret." Chapter 20, Keeling Island, Coral Formations. On April 1st, the Beagle reaches a part of the southern Indian Ocean where Keeling Island lay, nowadays also known as Cocos Island and governed by Australia. Keeling Island, along with many other islands in this part of the world, is an atoll, a ring-shaped island that is built on a coral reef, with a lagoon in the middle. Since the islands are small and isolated, there are very few animals and no land birds, at least none that Darwin could find. Coconuts are plenty common as they gave these islands their name, and so are insects. Additionally, he studies crabs, turtles, and some beautiful fish. The rest of this chapter is largely dedicated to what might be called a pet theory of Darwin about the origin of atolls and coral reefs. He would later write one of his first scientific articles on this geological phenomenon. His theory is, briefly said, that step 1 was to have a submarine volcano create an island. Step 2 was to have coral begin to grow just below the waterline of this island. Step 3 was to have the part of the island that was above water either sink back down or perhaps erode away by wind and water, leaving behind only the circle of corals. The top of these largely submerged coral reefs, if they get close enough to the surface, can be a place for sand and mud to build up, until it breaches the surface and become a circular island. Chapter 21, Mauritius to England. On April 29, the Beagle is north of Mauritius, also known as Ile-de-France, off the coast of Africa. An island infamous for hungry Dutch sailors eating all the dodos, though modern research has revealed that these Dutch sailors are likely less to blame than is commonly assumed. This used to be a French colony, and today it is a sovereign nation, but in Darwin's day it was British, even though the culture was still very French. On May 9, he leaves Port Louis, and 2 months later, after passing around Africa and the Cape of Good Hope, where Darwin and Fitzroy have a brief but impactful meeting with the famous astronomer John Frederick William Herschel, they reach St. Helena, a small isolated island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, still under British control, and the final resting place of Napoleon. They stay there for 4 days, and Darwin examines not just the geology but also the ecology, and notices that it has changed dramatically when compared to the descriptions of this island given by some early European sailors. Then they move on to Ascension, another small island some 800 miles or 1300 kilometers northwest of St. Helena. They arrive on the 19th, and Darwin of course goes on another exploration. One interesting thing he finds are so-called lava bombs, seemingly large blobs of lava that cooled, giving an interesting pattern when one examines a cross-section of it. Overall, despite only spending a limited amount of time there, Darwin is quite interested in the geology, saying, "Where on the face of the earth can we find a spot on which close investigation will not discover signs of that endless cycle of change to which the earth has been, is and will be subjected?" So now we're almost back in England, right? Wrong. Captain Fitzroy needs to make a stop in Brazil again, because he needs to double check some longitude measurements. All very much to the dismay of the homesick crew. But this gives Darwin an excuse to give a long and powerful anti-slavery monologue. He describes some heartbreaking events he witnessed in the slave country of Brazil. At one point, he describes a situation where he was with a rather powerfully built black slave, who had a hard time understanding him. And like every tourist ever, Darwin repeats his words again, but slower and louder, which frightened the enslaved man as he feared he would be hit. But unlike most people when they fear being hit, instead of raising his hands to protect his face, he lowered them as to not obstruct the white man's anger. Another scene he observed was of families being torn apart and sold separately. He remarks, "It makes one's blood boil, yet hearts tremble to think that we Englishmen and our American descendants, with their boastful cry of liberty, have been and are so guilty." On August 31st, the Beagle pays a final visit to Porto Praia and then to the Azores, and finally reaching England again on October 2nd, 1836. Conclusion. Here are some of my own takeaways after reading Darwin's book and doing some more research surrounding that voyage. First of all, I like Charles Darwin. He seems to have been a very amiable and friendly fellow who was kind, smart, humble, patient, and extremely curious. Secondly, science is a collaborative process. I wasn't able to put much emphasis on this aspect of his book, but if you read the footnotes, you will find that he frequently talks about books he read and questions he posed to fellow naturalists and the answers they provided. Thirdly, the sciences of biology, paleontology, and especially geology are not library sciences. You must get your steps in, your hands dirty, and your feet calloused. Surely, reading a lot of books and scientific articles will be of great help, but unless you go out and do some real field work, your understanding of and contribution to these scientific fields will remain limited. Fourthly, the theory of evolution is the result of solving a difficult puzzle. We may see Darwin's solution to this puzzle in more detail in future videos, but even he wasn't able to fully solve everything right away. It is perfectly fine to challenge or criticize the theory of evolution, regardless of your motivation. But a scientist will see your challenge or criticism and, if it is well constructed, will see it not as a reason to abandon the theory, but to continue to work on this puzzle. If you are a creationist, criticizing evolution alone is not enough. You must try to solve the puzzle yourself if you want to see the scientific community replace the theory of evolution with some form of creationism. Therefore, those creationists who are actively working on alternative models are the most promising. Sometimes it's a swing and a miss, and sometimes they've only taken a dozen steps on a 1,000-mile journey. But these are the creationists I appreciate the most. Finally, though I don't mind when Christian apologists talk about the social benefits of having a Christian culture, it would be a mistake to overemphasize it. This is because there are nominally Christian societies that are no improvement at all. Additionally, one can always give examples of real or idealized versions of other religions or secularism that are even better for society. Personally, I am interested in Christianity's truth value first and foremost, and its benefits, societal or personal, are merely corroborating. Thanks for watching. If you want to support me on Patreon or become a member on YouTube, follow the links in the description so you can see my videos early, vote on topics, ask questions, and more. Coming up next, For my next video in this series, I want to take a closer look at one of the ways we determine the age of certain things. Specifically, I want to examine how radiocarbon dating, also known as carbon-14 or C14 dating, works, and what it does and does not tell us about evolution and the age of the Earth.